All right. Hi, everyone tuning into this presentation for the Global Health Students and Young Professional Summit. Our topic for today, as you would have seen here, is sparking innovation. So specifically, how can we build social enterprises with the ultimate goal of addressing global health challenges? My name is Haley Moondeva. I'm the founder and CEO of ThriveHire, which is an online career platform that's built for the global health industry. So with that said, I'm a social entrepreneur and I'm also a certified social enterprise trainer. Before this though, I have a background in global health research. So I've worked for several years on different global health research projects in East Africa and also earned a Master's of Public Health degree. If you'd like to connect with me online, you're more than welcome to. You can reach out to me either on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter at the handle Haley Moondeva.
Thanks, Haley, and hi, everyone. My name is Annalise Maters, and for the past few years, I've also worked for ThriveHire, primarily in a data analyst and research officer role. Like Haley, I completed my Master's of Public Health a few years ago, and during that time and since then have really devoted to pursuing a career in public health research. A lot of my work has touched on a number of different fields, including pharmacy practice, tobacco control, and vaping, public health ethics, and a number of different fields. As Haley mentioned, you can also connect with me at my LinkedIn handle below.
Perfect. With that said, here is our outline for today's presentation. So just to start off, we're first going to be clarifying some key terms, in particular, actually defining what a social enterprise is and what it isn't. We're then going to be going into comparisons and really focusing on similarities between public health and social entrepreneurship. And then the bulk of today's presentation is actually going to be focusing on tangible steps that you can take yourselves to actually build successful social enterprises. And then towards the end, Annalise and myself are going to be outlining some tips and lessons that we've learned based on our experience with building ThriveHire to date, along with extra resources. And finally, we'll wrap up with some questions. So with that said, let's get started. So a social enterprise is, of course, something that we've been, is a term that we've been throwing around quite a bit here so far, but we really want to get clarity about what a social enterprise actually is. According to Common Good Solutions, as you would see here, a social enterprise is essentially a market-driven business that addresses a community issue. So that community issue can be a social problem, it can be an environmental challenge, a cultural issue, or an economic problem. So just to pick this apart a little bit further, many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with for-profits, and basically in their namesake, their objective, of course, is to actually generate a profit. And so how for-profit businesses do this is they sell a product or service with the intention of actually getting revenue. And if they do this well, hopefully they can get more revenue than what it takes in terms of cost to actually build that product or service. And if they do it well, they can end up generating a profit. So in terms of healthcare, probably a for-profit entity that you're quite familiar with is like a pharmaceutical company. Moving right along then, in terms of nonprofits, again, something you're probably quite familiar with, typically nonprofits have emerged to essentially address some of the really important community and social challenges that for-profits have overlooked. In terms of like typical nonprofits that you're familiar with, things like the Red Cross or the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research is a really great nonprofit in Canada that, of course, is focused on global health research. Also World Vision, Save the Children. Again, these are all nonprofit entities that have come in to really address important social issues. And typically with a nonprofit, they use a model where often they're reliant, not always, but often they're reliant on donations or corporate sponsorships, for instance, where they go to these for-profit entities and ask to get sponsored so that ultimately they have the financial capital that they need to deliver these programs. And again, the whole point is to address really important social and community issues. With that said, a social enterprise has emerged as a rather new entity over the last few decades to essentially merge both of these models from a nonprofit and a for-profit entity. So like a for-profit, a social enterprise, again, if you go back to that definition, it is a business. So like a for-profit, it builds a product or service with the intention of actually generating revenue. However, rather than only doing this to get a profit, social enterprises come into the world, they're brought into existence with, like a nonprofit, there's a really strong social mission. So again, the whole point of generating this revenue is to address a social, environmental, or community challenge. So they have that social mission like a nonprofit. However, they're applying a completely different model in order to bring that social mission to life. And they're adopting that ultimately from the for-profit entity. So with that said, an example of a social enterprise, some of you may be familiar with this, but this is an organization, it's a Canadian entity, it's called Lucky Iron Fish. Any of you that watch Dragon's Den, you may have even seen this live on Dragon's Den, but essentially this was started by a founder who went to Cambodia and saw that iron deficiency was a really prevalent issue within several different Cambodian communities. And so after getting that insight, they basically, through this business, created this image that you can see here on this screen. And essentially, this is like a block of iron that people can ultimately throw into their stewing pots. And as a result of it, it basically infuses whatever you're cooking with iron. And so it's a really critical way to ultimately address iron deficiency. And the reason that they actually built it into like the shape of a fish is after doing lots of research with local Cambodian communities, they realized that this was a really culturally relevant shape. I think fish, I'm not sure if it's a symbolism, it has a symbolism of luck, probably, that would make sense, as lucky iron fish. But ultimately what they do is they built this product, which they actually sell. But again, the whole purpose is to address a really important social problem, being iron deficiency. So that's essentially what a social enterprise is.
Thanks, Haley. So given the context and background and example Haley just provided of social enterprises, you might be starting to notice that there are quite a few parallels between social entrepreneurship and public health. You might have just not have noticed them quite before previously because conventional MPH or public health background type degrees don't necessarily focus on a lot of this kind of business oriented terminology. But to kind of drive this point home, we thought it would be really useful to take a look at the overlaps between public health program planning and social enterprise development cycles. So here, you've probably come across this kind of cyclical diagram before in some of your public health training. And to go through this really quickly, we usually begin by identifying a problem. So for example, we might know or predict that charcoal stoves are making respiratory problems worse for individuals living in a certain community. The next step we usually go through is engaging stakeholders on the ground who will be really critical in helping us conduct kind of what we would consider a formal needs assessment. So really making sure that we're integrating various stakeholder perspectives into designing an intervention. So taking this kind of engagement and feedback into consideration, we then usually go about formally planning and designing an intervention. We can then pilot the intervention in the community where we gather evidence as we move towards monitoring and evaluating the program over time. After a certain duration, we typically wrap up one stage of the program by either reporting our findings and scaling the program, maybe redesigning it, or maybe closing it down. What may be new to you is the strong overlap between the public health program planning cycle I just presented and what you'll see in this diagram, which we consider the social enterprise development cycle. So the development of a social enterprise usually traces kind of the same iterative pathway as the public health program planning. The main differences usually focus in on the nuances of the terminology used at different stages. So in this cycle diagram, you'll see number 4, we have defining a value proposition. So this is usually identifying why someone would want to purchase your product or service. And then after that, we have developing an MVP or minimum viable product. And this is your first product or service that is launched. So we just want to present these up front. We'll go into each of these stages and terms throughout our presentation today, as Haley mentioned, focusing a lot on the steps involved in building a social enterprise, but just wanted to present a lot of the similarities that are evident in those two cycles. So our main takeaway with showing you those two diagrams is really to start to instill the confidence that even though you might not know it or might not have learned it yet, you already have a lot of the skills needed that are required to build your own successful social enterprise, but you also have the skills to be a really strong candidate for a job with a company that has a social enterprise mission or is a social enterprise itself.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Annalise. There's certainly so many overlaps, and I think that's something that both Annalise and myself were really surprised to find once we ventured into the social enterprise world, that there were ultimately so many skills that we already gained through getting a master's of public health and ultimately starting our careers in public health. So with that said, like I mentioned at the very start of today's presentation, this is where we're going to focus mostly on in terms of actual tangible steps that you need to walk through in order to build a successful social enterprise. So this really just expands on the last cycle that Annalise just alluded to. We've added a couple more steps in there. Feel free to take a screenshot here if you'd like, but we'll be walking through these individually. All right, so the first step is defining your problem. Defining a problem may sound really straightforward, but honestly, it's a bit of a science, and there's a way to do it really well. So a formula here for defining a problem is essentially that a problem X has to be linked to a poor health outcome of Y. So in other words, if we solve X, we should see improvements in Y. Okay, so a couple of examples that we've included here is, for instance, charcoal stoves are exacerbating respiratory health issues in Ghana, or inaccessibility to gyms are increasing obesity rates in urban centers in South Africa. Now, a couple of points we just really want to drill down on here is ultimately a really strong problem statement should be very clear. You know, these are not confusing statements. They're very straightforward. They're very, very tangible, and ultimately they're very focused. Like, notice here how we're not trying to talk about several problems at once. Another thing is that you'll see here is we're not talking whatsoever about solutions, which is really important because you don't want to get ahead of yourself. It's just, again, it's very focused, it's clear. Going back to the formula, it's X problem is linked to Y poor health outcome. And ultimately, the importance of having this as your very first step is you want to make sure that everything you do with your social enterprise always goes back to trying ultimately to solve this important social or environmental problem. Okay, so that's the very first step, is problem definition.
The second step that we usually go through is stakeholder mapping. And I think that as a general rule, stakeholder mapping tends to sound pretty simple. But in my opinion, it really requires a thorough review of all of the individuals and or groups who could either influence, affect, or be affected by your product or service. So this is particularly important when we undertake social impact work that it aims to address pressing issues. So like Haley presented in the overview of a social enterprise, this is really core to the mission of your company. So in order to conduct effective stakeholder mapping, identifying and gathering information from stakeholders who might have different interests, different perspectives, different levels of power, and other factors is really critical, because then we can try and unpack the relationships both between stakeholder groups and then also how they relate to your product or service. And then on the next slide here, if you haven't seen this diagram before, I'd really encourage you to use it moving forward when mapping out stakeholders. The four areas of this diagram reflect both the varying power and the impact on the stakeholder. So you'll be assigning stakeholders to each of these quadrants, but one really important thing to keep in mind is that you'll be doing this iteratively. So the positioning of each stakeholder can really change throughout the course of developing your social enterprise, and it's something that you're going to want to keep coming back to reflect on where each stakeholder is positioned in relation to how your social enterprise is developing. Just to go through this diagram really quickly to give you an overview, in the bottom left corner, shows stakeholders who rank lower on both power and how affected they would be by the product or service. So here, it's really advisable to maintain contact with these stakeholders with a really light touch approach, but that's about the extent of managing them. So this isn't a stakeholder group that's going to need, daily updates on what's happening. Moving up to the top left quadrant, this area is for stakeholders who have a lot more power, but are still not hugely affected. So here it's advisable to keep them very highly informed of what's going on. I like to think of it as kind of knowledge is power for this group, but they don't require a lot of management. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have stakeholders with less power, but who will be pretty profoundly affected by your product or service. So this means that you're going to want to try and both anticipate their needs, the needs of these stakeholders, in order to best manage them, and then also meet those needs accordingly. The top right quadrant is kind of the bread and butter. So this is the group that you're going to want to spend the most time communicating with. They're the group that's going to be the most affected, but they're also the most powerful group. I think of it as these are your key stakeholders. You're going to want to connect with them regularly, thoroughly, ensure their needs are met and that their perspectives are highly considered at each stage. So moving on to step 3, this is our needs assessment and market research. The aim here is to invest substantial time in learning about your business problem that you've identified and your stakeholders. So here you really want to become an expert in understanding your market, your customers, as this will inform the gap that your social enterprise aims to fill. It also serves to inform what or who else is working in the same area and that the work that they've already completed, both so you can use this to your advantage to build a better product or service, but also to avoid overlap. There's no point in having two products that kind of are trying to do the same thing. So really important to keep that in mind. Market research and conducting a needs assessment can take the form of various kinds of research you've probably learned a lot about through your public health training and research courses. Some of the main ways to identify community needs include key informant interviews, focus groups, town halls, surveys. All of these are really excellent ways to gather data and get feedback from some of your stakeholders. Additionally, I think it's really wise to consider the leading organizations or companies that can provide key statistics and information that have been collected over time. So this kind of relates to the last point about secondary research. So the goal of this is trying to identify trends and patterns in the data that will help you to understand your market, your customers, your stakeholders, both for your company to develop a better product, but most importantly, to understand their needs and address them. On this note, this is probably one of my favorite slides in the presentation. We've put together some really solid market research questions you can use when you're approaching stakeholders. So as Haley mentioned, there will probably be a couple times in the presentation where we encourage you to take a picture of the slide. This could be one of them. So yeah, a few questions to use when you're approaching stakeholders. The first that I'd like to point out is to know your purpose. So in one sentence, what do you hope to achieve by talking to this person or group? So approaching each stakeholder with the intention of having a really meaningful conversation, but also looping it back into your business problem. What is the thing that you're trying to solve? The purpose of this is gaining more feedback, different perspectives. So going into each conversation, knowing your purpose. Number 2 is to use a funneled approach. So here I think of it as starting out really general and getting specific. A couple of reasons we do this. Definitely important to build rapport with every stakeholder. You want to walk into each conversation with an open mind, wanting to learn things from that group or individual. So starting off your questions to really understand their perspectives, what's coming across, and then narrowing down to more specific questions that get at your purpose. So again, what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the one thing you want to get out of this question? Or sorry, one thing you want to get out of this conversation. Point number 3 I have here is to ask open-ended and neutral questions. Here, you really want to avoid siloing any of your stakeholders' perspectives. So you don't want to lead them down a certain path. You want their opinions and perspectives to really emerge organically. And you also want to make sure that you are phrasing questions in a way that allows them to feel comfortable and provide their honest feedback. So not asking leading questions is really important as well. The way this kind of formula I like to use with this is the 5 W's and the H. So what, who, when, where, why, and how. I feel like these really get at asking deeper questions. It's not a yes or a no, which elicits better perspectives from your stakeholders. And then the last point I have here is to listen actively. I think this is really important at every single stage of developing your social enterprise, and especially when you're having repeat conversations with some stakeholders. So you don't want to anticipate what your stakeholders want or need. Like I've said before, you want their opinions to really come to the surface in their own words, without any guidance of you. You're really just there to guide the conversation and loop it back into your business problem. So that's just a quick overview of how to ask some really good research questions that you can keep coming back to over the course of developing your social enterprise.
All right, so with that said, so you've identified your problem, you started mapping out your stakeholders, and you've also done market research, as Annalise went into, to really ultimately better understand your problem. With all of that said, the next step is identifying your value proposition and to start building a business model. So we'll go into this in further detail, but for those of you who aren't familiar exactly with what a value proposition is, it is ultimately the reason that a person or company, so whoever your customer is, it is ultimately the reason that they would actually benefit from using your product or service. So in other words, why would they come to you to purchase your product or service? That is what a value proposition is. And again, you really want to, like a problem definition statement, you want to have a lot of clarity over this. And it ultimately should be something that you continually come back to when you're making operational decisions within your business. Ultimately, you should always be asking yourself, by doing X or by pursuing XYZ activities, is this allowing our team to deliver on this value proposition? So in terms of coming up with the formula for a value proposition, here's a really simple one. So we help X group, or this is, X target market, that needs help with addressing X pressing concern succeed by providing this service or product, which brings them this ultimate outcome. So here's an example, and this is going back to Lucky Iron Fish, so that social enterprise that we had mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So we help families in Cambodia who are iron deficient succeed by offering Lucky Iron Fish products that they can conveniently throw into their cooking pots to increase iron intake into their diets. So this is a value proposition statement. Again, it's the why part of your business. Why would a customer actually want to come to you? So ultimately the why part, as you can see, is really the end outcome there. Ultimately to increase iron intake into their diets. So after you've actually identified a value proposition, your value proposition for your company, it's time to start doing some of the fun stuff, which is building a business model. So those of you who aren't familiar with the business model, it's nothing super complicated. Essentially, a business model is really just how does your business actually make money? So, what product or service do you sell, for how much, what activities are involved to actually bringing that product or service to market? So that's just what a business model is. It's how your business actually makes money. So as you can imagine, there's a bunch of different steps that are involved when you're coming up with your business model. But here's a really, really helpful resource that we at ThriveHire have gone back to continuously. It's highly referenced in the social enterprise and also just the business space more generally. It's called a business model canvas. We've included one here that's specifically for social enterprises. So it's a social business model canvas. I'm not going to walk through the whole thing here, but I would encourage you to take a screenshot. And if you'd like to research it further, I would highly recommend doing that. But essentially it just goes through a bunch of different areas that you need to have really clear understanding for when it comes to, again, bringing your product or service to market. This is the model in which you're using to generate revenue. So for instance, like Annalise already alluded to, who are your partners and key stakeholders? What is your cost structure? So again, you have an understanding of the problem, you understand the value proposition. So in other words, why would a customer actually come to you to purchase that product or service? But when it comes to pricing, what is your cost structure? And what is the biggest expenditure areas when it comes to actually building that product or service? Or you can think about what are the different channels that you need to go through in order to reach your customers or beneficiaries. So these are just, like I said, a bunch of different areas that you need to have a really clear understanding for when it comes to running your social enterprise. And one quick thing that I really want to emphasize here, the social business model canvas, really along with a bunch of different areas that we've spoken about, for instance, what stakeholders you can engage when it comes to your business. I really want to emphasize that this should ultimately be a very iterative process. You may find when you're creating the first draft of your business model canvas, it's truly just a rough draft, but I would suggest and actually emphasize coming back to this once a month. And once you get more information, you get more feedback from your customers, you try some things, you see what works, you see what doesn't work. Ultimately, with all that information, you should always be coming back to your business model canvas and fine tuning it. So I actually find it's a really helpful exercise, especially during the early stages of your social enterprise, to actually create a business model canvas once a month. And it ultimately, of course, should be building on more and more information that you're getting from your target customers, because they're the ones who you should be ultimately focused on the most. They know what their needs are, and based on the information you get, you can continue to iterate and come back to this. All right, so moving right along. So again, you've identified your value proposition, you've come up with the business model. Now it's time to ultimately start getting some sales and testing to see, is there actually demand for your product or service? So in terms of sales, I'm going to be going over the process for getting pre-orders, or what we also call letters of intent, or LOIs for short. So when it comes to getting to doing sales, I really want to emphasize that the goal is to ultimately be starting this process as soon as possible, and ideally actually before or as you start building your product or service. Ultimately, you actually want to try to see, is there demand for your product or service? One thing we're going to be drilling down on throughout this whole presentation is, when you're building a social enterprise, you're always making a ton of assumptions about what your customers and what your community actually needs. And so through sales, it's actually an opportunity to, again, gauge if there's complete demand for your product or service. So get going on it as soon as possible. Like I said, even if you can, before you start building. And yes, there is actually a way to do it before you start building. You've probably all come across this yourselves, maybe when you're purchasing different products. Like for instance, I just did this a couple of weeks ago. There was a really great book that I was interested in purchasing on Amazon. And of course you could do pre-orders. So I literally paid for the book several weeks in advance, and then it arrived on my Kindle the day it went live. Or another way is through these letters of intent, which essentially are a letter that you give to a target client. They don't actually pay for anything, so a pre-order is even better because you're actually getting payment. But a letter of intent is essentially you give a target client this letter that says, hello, we work with, for instance, at ThriveHire, this is a product that we're offering. Are you interested? Would you be interested in actually purchasing this once it is developed and goes live? And then essentially you ask your target client to sign that letter. And again, it's ultimately a way for you to better gauge, is there demand for your product or service? So do it really early if you can. Another thing that I want to stress here is sales is really not just a one-way pitch that can create tension between you and your target customer. But instead, it's like anything, it's a two-way conversation. It's like anything, you're building a relationship here. So it's not just about having this one-way pitch, but you should try to ultimately build rapport with your client. And the last thing that I want to emphasize is the goal is we almost have to shift our perspective when it comes to sales. It can be a bit intimidating, but the goal is actually it's not just about securing the sale, but it's essentially an opportunity for you to get more market research as well. So you can, for instance, ask really important questions to your target clients, and as a result, you can get more feedback and information from them about what their needs are. And even if you don't secure the sale, or for instance, if they say, I can't do this now, but come back to me in several months or whatever it is, at the end of the day, after that sales call, you ultimately have way more information about, again, more individuals within your target community. And that's really important information regardless. So the goal is not just about securing a sale. So with that said, here's a formula for a sales pitch. I'm not going to go into this in depth because we don't have time for this presentation, but I would encourage you again to take a screenshot. One thing I really want to emphasize here is, as you would see, I've actually highlighted the questionnaire in red, because again, I really just want to stress that a sales call is, again, a really important opportunity to get more information about this target customer that you're speaking with. And so, yeah, I think you should really spend a bulk of the sales call on that. Typically what we do at ThriveHire is, again, we go through like an opener, like for instance, how are you? We thank them for taking the time to speak with us today. You know, we provide a bit of context of what we're going to be talking about on the call. And then we usually go through 4 questions, very pointed questions, so that we can better understand, you know, what are their pain points when it comes to recruiting. And again, that's really important information for us that we take back to our team and analyze to, you know, better improve our services. And then after that, and only after that point, do we actually start going into the pitch. You know, I have a lot of, for instance, through different social enterprise programs where I've taught different social entrepreneurs. It's really typical for first-term entrepreneurs to start a sales call with the pitch at the start, and it's really awkward, as you can imagine. Maybe you, for instance, have been on the receiving end of calls like that. It's really clunky. It's really awkward. And so again, I really want to emphasize, if you can, really try to ask questions up front. It builds rapport, and it ultimately gives you and your business really important information about your client.
Thanks, Haley. That's a perfect segue of asking those questions. I'd like to turn that into our next step, which is defining clear benchmarks and KPIs, or key performance indicators. So as Haley was saying, even though that sales pitch, that sales conversation can be used to narrow down on some of the indicators that are going to give you a really clear read if that company is interested, what are their pain points and that sort of thing. So KPIs, like I said, key performance indicators, this may be an area that some of you are a bit less familiar with, but basically these refer to really tangible, critical measurements of factors that will give you a radar signal if your social enterprise is progressing or succeeding. So these indicators ultimately help you understand if all that work you've done to design your business problem and work with the business model canvas, if that's working and if you're on the right track with it. So when you're designing benchmarks or KPIs, there's a few things that you want to keep in mind. The first is to make sure that they're directly aligned with your problem statement. So that's something we're going to keep coming back to throughout this presentation, is making sure that alignment is really, really solid. You also want to make sure that your KPIs or any benchmarks you set are really well-rounded. What I mean by this is that they encompass kind of a number of factors rather than just one number. So you want to understand how people are engaging with your service or product on a number of fronts. So this leads really nicely into a point about how you collect data, how you analyze data. There are many digital platforms that are available to help you streamline your data collection and analysis. I think one of the biggest things we've learned at ThriveHire is being able to upfront identify benchmarks and KPIs, streamline the collection of all that data coming in from different sources is really important, because you want to be able to use those different data points to pivot really quickly. So is this indicator working? If it is, what's the next benchmark we can set? So like I said, allowing for the updating and tweaking of benchmarks over time is really important. But if something isn't working so well, you also want to be able to pivot really quickly, so you can tweak that benchmark to reflect a different channel that you could be pulling that data from, or try a different form of customer engagement and see what kind of response that elicits. So again, like I've said, through stakeholder mapping, and we've mentioned through the other points, defining, setting benchmarks and KPIs is a really iterative process over time, and something that you'll be coming back to time and time again throughout the development of your social enterprise. Just to give you a really quick example of ways to measure social impact, we've presented this formula that you can use for setting some of your own. So by this time, we aim to achieve X tangible result. So just to give you an example of kind of an indicator that we've used in our own work at ThriveHire, by March 2021, we aim to have had 600 people getting hired through our platform. We aim for 90% of users to be satisfied with the knowledge and connections they gain through the platform. So as you can see, this statement is really concrete. It identifies the exact number of people and the exact percentage that we're aiming for. It gets at kind of understanding and analyzing this statement from a number of different angles. How many people are getting hired? How are they getting hired? What is the user satisfaction, and how are they kind of identifying knowledge and connections through our platform? So just want to provide this and two other examples above of social impact measurement statements that you can tweak for your own company.
Thanks for that, Annalise. So with that said, we're going on to step 7, which is building an MVP, or a minimal viable product. Yes, at this point, step 7 of this 9-step framework is when you actually start really building something. And it's kind of an interesting observation to make, because as many of you are probably very familiar with when it comes to global health work, you probably hear this quite often, and we absolutely need to pay attention to this. It's not something to underemphasize, but when it comes to building global health interventions or public health interventions, there's really an importance of really understanding what your community needs are. And again, putting your assumptions in check, especially when we're working in intercultural settings. Again, we're always making assumptions about what people's demands are. And so by having step 7 about building your MVP, or actually at this point you start building a bare minimum version of your product or service, we really want to get across that there's a lot of planning that goes into building a social enterprise. And you have to get, again, clarity about what is your problem that you're actually solving? What is your value proposition? Which stakeholders do you need to engage? How can you do really solid market research so that you really understand some of the nuances behind some of the challenges that your customers are experiencing? And only once you start really understanding each of those different aspects can you start building something. And so often what social entrepreneurs, or just entrepreneurs in general, fall into this trap is they start building something right away. And ultimately, they start building a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, and that is written in assumption. So anyways, just a quick point I want to emphasize here, only step 7 do we actually start building something. So with that said, a minimal viable product, I started going into it a little bit there, but what it is essentially a very simple, in other words, complete bare minimum version of your product or service to satisfy your customer needs and ultimately get feedback for future development. So it's a very, very simple version of your product. And the purpose here is to test, again, if your assumptions are correct. Do people actually want this product or service idea before you build a fully fledged product or service, once hopefully you have access to more capital? So here's a really quick example of an MVP. So many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with Dropbox. So they're an interesting example of how they went about creating their minimal viable product. So what they did is they launched a very simple demo video. So in this video, they just, of course, demonstrated what their software could do, by sharing different files across people, across computers. This is what their software could provide to customers, and ultimately, again, the value or the value proposition by creating this specific product. So they hadn't actually built anything. Again, it was just a very simple demo video. I'm pretty sure if you Google this, you can find it, like, simple demo video, MVP, Dropbox, it should come up. But essentially by building that MVP, they asked for at the end of the video, they asked for signups for a wait list. And again, the whole point was to gauge, is there actually demand for this software if we go about, like, after this, if we actually start building this fully fledged technology. So again, they got signups for a wait list, and essentially through this very simple MVP or this demo video, they went from 5,000 users, or people on this wait list, to 75,000 people overnight. So again, it was a very simple, completely inexpensive, very resourceful way to test out, is there actually demand for this product?
Thanks, Haley, for that example. So we are on the second last step of what we've been presenting today, which is monitoring and evaluation. So this is probably an area you're very familiar with, have come across lots of times in your public health training. But just as in your training, it's really critical that this is continuously done throughout the development of your social enterprise. And this is for kind of a number of reasons. Number one, it offers insight on new products and services you can offer over time. So again, that importance of getting feedback from different stakeholders, identifying kind of pain points for them or new opportunities. Monitoring and evaluation also offers opportunities to reconnect with stakeholders. So again, very common theme throughout our presentation of having that initial conversation with someone is really great, but this is where that continuous mapping of the stakeholder onto that diagram I presented is really important. So making sure that you're creating opportunities for new feedback from the same stakeholders, and also identifying new stakeholders who you might want to gain perspectives from as well once you've developed that MVP. Another point with monitoring and evaluation that I'd like to mention is that it helps to identify successes, but more importantly, it really helps to identify failures. And I think that's something that none of us particularly relish, doing that deep looking at some of the things that haven't gone so well. But it's really critical to inform any kind of next stage decision-making and planning as you move forward with your social enterprise. And I think that's exactly what Haley was getting at with that example of the MVP is, you want to learn what isn't working or what people don't like. You also want to learn what they do like before you invest a lot of capital or time going down one certain road with this. So important to have those conversations within your team of what's going well, what's not going well, but also really important to loop back to your stakeholders to understand how their experiences might be different from what your team thinks, from what some of your funders or advisors think. So just having, again, that kind of iterative process of conversation. Another key point with monitoring and evaluation is that it demonstrates accountability and transparency. This is both really important, again, to you and your team of understanding, where resources and time and money are flowing, but it's also really important to your funders and also to any stakeholders that you've consulted with. So monitoring and evaluation also provides this platform where you can report findings, share lessons learned, and also plan for future directions. So all of these things are really important to keep coming back to throughout the development cycle of your social enterprise. That brings us to the final step, step 9, which is all about seeking feedback to iterate and scale your social enterprise. So ideally, kind of all the previous stages, numbers 1 through 8 that we've walked you through so far, will lead you to iterate and scale your social enterprise. But sometimes that's not always the case. And so we kind of want to leave you with what we call the 3 Ps, or 3 options that you can consider after your initial business pilot. And these will be taking into consideration stakeholder feedback, monitoring and evaluation, all the steps that you've completed above. So the 3 Ps that we point you to are pivot, persevere, or perish. So this really gets at pivoting. Have you identified feedback where you need to turn your business in a new direction based on feedback? Is it persevering? So you're going down one track and you think that there's enough traction there, you've got enough feedback that you just need to push through a little bit more. Or perish. Is this business problem that you've identified just not the right one, and you've kind of got to go back to the original drawing board of identifying a new business problem, going through that mapping process again. So ideally, we all want to iterate and scale, but just want to leave you with this slide to really drive home that this is truly an iterative process, and it's something that no matter which of the 3 Ps your business is falling under, it's always an opportunity to come back to the steps we've provided you above and work through those exercises again.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Annalise. So with that said, there's again a simple sort of 9-step framework. The framework itself is simple, but as Annalise just emphasized, and as we've done throughout this presentation, it's very iterative. You're going to be getting a ton of feedback from your community. And with that said, here's some tangible tips and lessons that we've learned through building our social enterprise of ThriveHire so far. So when you're walking through all of these different steps, we'd really stress to right at the very beginning, identify what success actually looks like to you. And this should, of course, be based on your values and the social mission that your enterprise is actually built on. So really with this, trust yourself. I think it's very easy, when you're trying to build a social enterprise from the ground up, you're going to be getting opinions left, right, and center about how you should approach your business. And I think, it's about taking a step back, having a bit of self-awareness to say, where are we even going here? And what does success look like for us specifically and our team? And ultimately that will anchor you through all the ups and downs that inevitably come with trying to build a social enterprise. Like I alluded to a little bit earlier, is really want to stress and emphasize prioritizing sales or letters of intent like upfront, ideally right before you build anything. This was a challenge that, we came across at ThriveHire. It's really easy to start building something and then only later do you start getting more feedback and information and start realizing, hey, over here, we actually need, going back to Annalise's last point, we need to pivot here and build this kind of product or service. And yeah, it's just really easy to get lost in trying to build something that people don't necessarily need. So try to really get sales or letters of intent up front. It's a way to actually see, are you delivering value? The best way to deliver value is to offer something and see if people will actually pay. Another thing is recruiting advisors. So getting an advisory board and also team members who have complementary skills. So in other words, people within and equally as important outside of the global health space. Ultimately, you want a really interdisciplinary team to cover various areas, and that's completely essential when it comes to building a social enterprise. So for instance, if your skill set isn't in financial analysis, well, of course, it's incredibly important that you understand numbers when it comes to building a successful social enterprise. So find people who complement gaps within your own skill sets. Keep it very simple. Even at the very start when we were going over, problem definition statements, don't try to solve multiple problems at once. It's very easy to get lost in the weeds or, get excited with new ways that you can grow your social enterprise, but just keep it really simple and continually come back to your value proposition. Are we able to actually deliver on this value that we say we're providing to this community? Keep it really simple, and especially at the start when you're being scrappy and resourceful, like really just try to downsize and buckle up with the things that you can actually deliver high quality around. And then lastly is, for those who may not be familiar with it, is really, emphasize, apply to accelerator programs. At ThriveHire, we've gone through 6 of these, and ultimately these programs are built to provide entrepreneurs with mentorship, funding, co-working spaces, business classes. It's really invaluable. So one, for instance, that we've gone through that specifically focuses on social entrepreneurship is the Social Venture Zone. That's based in Toronto out of Ryerson. I believe now, though, they're offering their programming all virtually. So if you're not based in Toronto, it could be a great way to get connected with that community. There's also a bunch of other communities that we've outlined here. And lastly, just some resources to check out. I would definitely emphasize this course called Entrepreneurship 101 by Mars Discovery District. On a personal note, I took this right at the very beginning of ThriveHire, and it's an online course, and I found it the most valuable course of any course that I've ever taken. I think especially if you're a newcomer when it comes to entrepreneurship, it's really, really helpful information. If you're further advanced, it may be a bit too simplistic, but it's really helpful, and they bring in entrepreneurs from across Canada, who've scaled things and had really successful businesses. Like, for instance, I remember the woman who founded Kijiji is on there, and you're basically getting one-on-one advice from successful entrepreneurs who've been there and done that. Also, feel free to check out this book. It's called The Lean Startup Methodology. If you get really into the entrepreneurship space, this is a concept that's heavily emphasized within entrepreneurship, and something, again, it's a really resourceful way, like just basically a way to be resourceful when you're trying to build a business. Also, again, check out the Social Business Model Canvas. If you didn't take a screenshot, Google it, it should come up. And then lastly, if you're wanting to get some resources or tools on how to craft a really simple but effective and persuasive business pitch or presentation, check out Guy Kawasaki's slide deck.
Perfect. So just to wrap up our presentation for today, we want to leave you with 3 key takeaways. So the first is that social entrepreneurship is one way of introducing an innovation that addresses a global health challenge. So again, social entrepreneurship might be kind of new to a lot of people listening today, but regardless, a lot of the skills that you already have acquired as global health or public health practitioners, you already have these skills that you can apply to build your own successful social enterprise or to join a really successful team that offers a product and also has a mission that you strongly identify with. So 2 key takeaways on that note is that this is a really exciting field where you have the ability to learn a lot more concrete skills and follow a social mission. The final takeaway is a thread that we've had throughout this entire presentation regarding the importance of getting data and feedback to test your assumptions. So again, you want to keep coming back to this and really analyzing yourself and your team's data, conversations with stakeholders in order to deliver a product or service that best aligns and will be best utilized by the community that you're trying to bring it to. And so just to wrap up, once again, we'd like to thank everyone listening online with us today. We're really excited to answer any questions that you might have. Just in the situation or case that we run out of time, you're also more than able to email us at info@thrivehire.org. So we've linked that at the bottom if you have any questions that we don't get to today, and we'll be more than happy to respond to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everyone.